with CEOs and millionaires. I've never seen my vision be more crystal clear. Look in the mirror, see the change in who I used to be. I kept going, knew success would come eventually. But ask about me back then, they said I wouldn't make it. Nowadays they doubt less and tend to ask for favors. Poetic music, that's realness, don't let them tell you different. And if you ever lost in doubt, then follow your intuition. These words of wisdom is for those who's trying to find their purpose. Don't be living just to die, cause only death is certain. I'm working hard so I can toast to my accomplishments. Cause see, I lost it all and I ain't been the same since. I'm more focused, more ambitious, more everything. Grew up with nothing, now I appreciate the finer things. I know it's real when at the shows they ask for autographs. And now they know the name, they ain't gotta ask. Yeah. They ain't gotta ask.
All right. Next guest here on the Esoteric Quandary podcast, I have Professor Jack Buffington. He's the program director, professor of the DU Supply Chain Program at the Daniels School of Business and the Denver Transportation Institute. The focus is on 21st century supply chain, and students and companies, as well as the industry, focus on problem solving, eliminating waste, and disruptive innovation to solve some of the greatest challenges we have in the world today. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. 2020, what a year for supply chain, right?
Well, it's an interesting year. I mean, it really highlighted, the criticality of the supply chain in our lives. A lot of times people don't understand how all these goods come about. And yet it's this intricate global supply chain that makes it happen. So 2020 kind of shocked a lot of people into understanding what impact it has on everybody's world.
Yeah, and the winners and losers of the supply chain definitely showed in the market, and obviously we kind of hit a lot of points, within class, but then also just keeping on with the reading afterwards. The buzzword is Omnichannel as far as operations go. So can you elaborate a little bit for folks on what Omnichannel is and how that's impacted 2020?
Yeah, it's a big talking point in supply chain, and you mentioned the winners and losers, and Omnichannel relates to how customers order products and how those products are fulfilled. And traditional channel is, of course, you walk into a store, you order something by picking it up, and then it's fulfilled by you walking out the store. And then traditional e-commerce is you ordering something on your computer and then it's showing up at your doorstep. Omnichannel represents the combination of any sort of mix and match between order and fulfillment that can possibly be conceived. And the companies that were able to be as fluid as possible, for example, using your storefront as a warehouse during the COVID pandemic, a lot of big box retailers were able to succeed in that manner. And for the most part, Amazon's driving change when it comes to this space, and it seems like everybody else is just trying to keep up. So you're right, you're seeing winners and losers based on this fluid model between customers and retailers.
And in supply chain management, who would you name? Can you name like maybe the top 3 companies that you generally refer to that you just know are kicking butt in from raw materials all the way down to purchase and consumption?
Yeah, well, I would say to start off with that the change is really being driven on the retail front. Before, supply chain change was driven by manufacturers. Back when supply chains became bigger after World War II into the 70s, it was, the big car companies, big food companies, they were driving the bus, so to speak, when it came to how supply chains operated. But then what happened was innovations were happening on the distribution side. And then on the retail side, and of course, the most notable companies when it comes to that are Amazon and Walmart. And most people maybe don't recognize that Walmart is actually a lot bigger than Amazon. And the challenge I think that Walmart was facing is that they weren't using its distribution network to its own advantage. It has the same amount of warehouse distribution space as Amazon. They both have about, I think it's like 150 million square feet of space. But the difference is Walmart has 5,000 stores across the United States, and their stores are, 90% of the population is within a drive of a Walmart store. And so Walmart was using, its distribution network separate from its retail network, and it wasn't taking advantage of that competing against Amazon, where now it is. So, these two companies are huge, not just from their physical distribution networks, but also their virtual and how they're using information. Then there's, of course, big food companies that are big players. If you go to a supermarket, you see all these different brands, but majority of the products that are in the supermarket are manufactured and distributed by a handful of companies. It's the Coke, it's the Nestle, it's the companies like that. So you're starting to see, you're continuing to see a proliferation of the big companies expanding their networks, when you mention raw materials through manufacturing, through distribution, and they don't necessarily own the whole supply chain, but they are able to manage and control it through information to be the most effective.
Got it. And so obviously we're talking about a lot of the continental United States companies. With some of the strategy amongst, our government with free trade and other things that we have cooperation with unilaterally with other countries directly, or with, like, for example, the European Union, how does that affect the supply chain in retrospect to the day-to-day regional sales and things like that? Is it better for the consumer, or is it kind of in between? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I always need to emphasize here that when we think of these companies, because you did mention correctly that I talked about so-called American companies, but they're really not. They're really multinational corporations. And having worked for one for a long period of time, I can tell you that our focus isn't necessarily on what's best for any one region of the world. Our company may have been started in the United States, but our goal is to improve the wealth of our shareholders. And that's been the focus of these large companies. And we can't expect them to do things that are in the best interests of the American citizens, so to speak. So they ebb and flow based upon the market conditions. And, what we're starting to see, of course, is an expansion of market conditions in other parts of the world, most notably Asia. Before like the 1500s, the largest, economic activity happened in this part of the world in India and China. And you're going to have to expect that the multinational corporations are going to flow in that direction. So when you talk about trade policy, what the governments can do, I think it's a little bit ill-advised for us to assume that we can reshore these companies. And I don't even think that's practical. I think that because it's been tried and not very successful, I think the best approach we could do is focus on supply chains and economic activity that are in the best interests of our citizens. And, the Venn diagram comes in the middle of what's best for these companies and what's best for our citizens is the optimal model for our supply chains.
Speaking of citizens, we had big news last week that one of the CEOs of our generation has officially stepped down. Still going to be a chairman, obviously, at Amazon, but he's going to focus on different ventures. Obviously, we're talking about Jeff Bezos. What do you think his legacy is going to be regarding supply chain here in the next 10 years, 10, 15 years? And he's not even done, so theoretically, but what do you see for the future for him as well?
Yeah, regarding his legacy, what's interesting about this model he came up with, and he started off, he wasn't even a supply chain guy. He was like a venture capitalist in the financial service industry, something like that, vice president in this industry. He came up with this idea to start a bookstore. And, he wanted to be the world's largest bookstore. And really what he was creating is this connection between the customer and distribution, and even told his investors, like, this idea is really good, but it's probably not going to work, right? But really what his legacy has been customer focus. Like if you work at Amazon, everything they do is focused on what's best for the customer. And even so much so that, there's news out there about challenges with how workers are treated at Amazon fulfillment centers. And it's a tough place to work, right? And there's no bones about it, but the whole organization understands that it's what's best for the customer. And that does become somewhat of a oxymoron or paradox, or whatever the term you want to use, of what's best for the customer versus what's best for, the stakeholder, which could be a citizen or a worker. I would say the other thing that his legacy will note on is the whole concept and use of analytics and big data. It's been over 10 years ago where Amazon came up with this idea of anticipatory shopping, of gathering data to understand what the customer wants before the customer wants it, which is able to set into motion this whole concept of next day shipping, where they're shipping a phone case that retails for $10 and it costs $10 to ship, and people are like, well, how is that even possible, right? It's this whole model of how they understand the customer and how the whole supply chain is driven through this customer satisfaction model, which he's been the driver of, just this whole focus on the customer. And so what does that mean regarding his legacy? A lot of times these guys go off and start to figure ways, to donate their money. And I don't know how much of a, you look at like the Microsoft model and the Apple models, what happens when the founders are no longer the CEO. I do think that the culture that he's established, he'll still be a part of that. And the problem I'd say with that model is it's not sustainable. And what's interesting about him leaving now is I do think that Walmart's primed to start, really starting to hit Amazon's market share. And then, if you think about other models like a American Alibaba model of retail, I wonder if Amazon, they'll always be a big company, but I wonder if it will remain that way. And then, of course, you have the other issue of whether the government will break it up. So it's a really interesting timing for him to move on.
Yeah, did you watch any of the congressional hearings when he was on there along with the other folks, Facebook and what have you? He just seemed very annoyed to having to be there. And I think, honestly, his time dealing with that kind of crowd and having to be subjected to some kind of, quasi witch hunt in a sense of how he runs his business, he was just like, I'm out. I don't need this. I've done what I wanted to accomplish. So it's interesting enough to watch. I would suggest it. Obviously, you were talking about some of the trade practices that he had, or the company had, in regards to labor and things like that. Do you feel that unions adversely affect supply chain, or do they benefit it in the long run?
Interesting question. So I've dealt with unions in my career. I would say it's a little bit of a, what's the right term? I don't know if it's a false narrative or a distraction. I'm a big believer in supply chain being a function of supply and demand imbalance. I do think that our supply chains today create consumers totally separate from workers. And, this has happened in the United States. And if we want to get into a little bit of socioeconomics, if you look at the wage gap inequality, a lot of it has to do with the imbalance between people who've gone to college and work in a white collar field versus people who typically worked in manufacturing and work in a blue collar field. And so when we have these supply chains that are obsessed with consumer satisfaction, we bifurcate us as consumers and we separate those of us who are workers, right? And, there's different paths on how to get there. unionization is one, but it doesn't necessarily have to be unions, right? It can be other ways of optimizing supply chains as opposed to minimizing and maximizing supply chains. I think that's the challenge that we face right now is people aren't, I mean, it's not just in this, but people aren't recognizing that when you get next day shipping, it's coming as a function of somebody being worked really hard in the Amazon fulfillment center or somebody rushing around in a truck to get it there. And it's the same issue with sustainability is that, people say they're in favor of sustainability, but then more of their shipments are hitting their doorstep, which is more, single-use waste versus if you go to a big box retailer. So there's definitely some cognitive dissonance between us as consumers and us as citizen workers that ultimately will need to be addressed.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Another one is fast fashion. Somebody is dealing with worker, issues and what have you, but they'll wear something that's going to fall apart within, 2 times of wearing it.
Yep.
Vaccinations and the overarching plan that our country have had, what would you rate our research and development, like the whole process from the time that we knew something was going on, we needed to close up shop in our country and try to fight this while we come up with a vaccine and all through that process? What would you rate our system at?
Yeah, so let me start off with giving out the A's. And while I'm not an epidemiologist or any sort of scientist in that manner, the fact that we're able to get these vaccines through, and by the way, I think it was like the RNA sequencing, the genetic sequencing of it happened over a weekend, right? And the manufacturing of it and the testing and everything like that happened in 7 to 9 months is unbelievable, at least for someone who's a lay person like me. The other area I would give an A to is the supply chain distribution system, which everybody was raising concerns about regarding keeping the cold chain requirement. And it's not even cold chain, it was frozen, beyond frozen chain requirement of being able to ship it from the manufacturer to distribution. And the companies that were involved in that has been seamless. I mean, there haven't been, other than, fraudulent issues of vaccines going to waste as a function of the supply chain system. So I think both of those segments get A's for what they've accomplished. I think it's this public-private partnership of, and probably more so of federal-state partnership of allocation, distribution sites, determining, I think probably the most egregious one is that, who gets it first. Unfortunately, there's 70-year-old plus that don't have computers. And then there's other people who just keep tapping their computer to see when an appointment is available. And that's really not good to see, that we're just not distributing it the way we should. And, if you listen to the people I talk to who are involved in this, they will tell you that probably in a little bit over a month to 2 months, they're going to have more supply than demand. And the focus should be on the other side of it now, because people like us, I'm assuming, who want the vaccine and think it's the right thing to do, in a very short period of time, we'll be able to get it. And then the question will be, what about the rest of the population in the United States? What about the rest of the population in the world? So in a very quick period of time, we're going to shift from a supply problem to a demand problem is how do we get more people vaccinated? And if you look at how the whole thing has went down from the supply challenges, it concerns me probably even more so of how we're going to get more people vaccinated in order to get to a safer way of living, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Yeah. And do you feel that a centralized or decentralized version of a plan and implementation is more effective during like a national emergency like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the first administration focused on federalism, where the federal government's job was to just advocate and administrate to the states. And you got to believe that under a crisis like this, that you have to move to more of a centralized model. If you look at what's happening in other countries that don't have the same federalism that we have, most notably countries in Asia, they've dealt with these challenges much better than we have, most notably Taiwan, Japan, Singapore. You wouldn't go so far as to say what China's doing, because that just isn't the way, democracies work. But there are, democracies in these regions that have used more of a centralized approach that has been more effective.
And the Association of Supply Chain Management, have they been working congruently with the federal government on providing support as far as strategic planning and things like that during this time?
It's been more of the private companies that have been involved, like the FedExes, the UPSs, the McKessons, companies like that are the experts when it comes to, distribution of cold chain or distribution of medical supplies. And like I said, and I know some people that are in that space, and they've been great. I think their relationship in working with a lot of people on the federal side who are mainly from the military has worked much better than I thought, because how military supply chains work and private supply chains are different, but they've actually come together really nicely. I think that's been a really good thing to see. The challenge would be, I think, after you get out of the phase 1A, where it's so easy to vaccinate people because they're in nursing homes, they're in hospitals, healthcare workers, nursing home people. But as you get into the later stages of distribution, it's going to be a lot harder. And I see favorable signs of retail distribution, versus how do we find it? How do we get it in the less concentrated parts of the country where, you're starting to hear about, inner cities where, they don't have a Walgreens or a CVS, and there's not a direct bus to get people there. So anyway, I think these challenges need to be addressed. I was watching something yesterday in Brazil. They're getting out to people in the Amazon jungle. So, the challenges for distribution will get greater as you go farther down into the tranches of people. And that gets back to my issue of demand. And how do we get more people who are in some of these areas who may be more reluctant to get a vaccine to get vaccinated?
Yeah, definitely. And, unfortunately, I think the federal government was just a little, how would I put it? They weren't forthcoming with some of the information that they had, and they led some people astray, and they just needed that little tidbit of information that didn't come out to basically say, like, if they're not telling the truth now, in a sense, or holding back information, then we're not going to trust you with this vaccine, which is unfortunate because it's only going to prolong the process.
Let me add to that, because I've asked, like being in supply chain as long as I have, I work for an industry that's absolutely not as important as a vaccine, beer industry. But, like we have big challenges, big transformational projects, and the degree of what we put plans together are very intricate details. If we open a brewery, shut a brewery, change our network, we'll put this very detailed plan together. And so knowing that this is how things happen, I was talking to people who are involved in this, and I was like, well, didn't they have all these, they had 9 months to work through these details. And sadly, they didn't have the details to the level that they needed.
Right.
That if you think about like how our supply chains work, creating a vaccine is a miracle, but everything else is stuff that we know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us are just shaking our heads saying, we all know how to do this. Why weren't these details in place? That's a shame. You're right. And it does impact people's trust in the whole process.
And with that just to add to what you just mentioned, supply chain management, is it design or is it execution or both, or you just need different types of supply chain specialists to be every part of the factor of that process in there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I don't think anybody expected when they took this on that they would have every fact correct. But our field is I classify our field as a STEM field: science, technology, engineering, and math. We're constantly seeking additional data, and as we gather data, we make corrections from what's happening in execution and change it in plan. And if you do a connection between the number of places that are making the serum through the whole distribution chain, it's not that many nodes involved. That's my point. And so the data that you could gather on what's happening is not overwhelming. If you think about like an Amazon network of, hundreds of millions of customers connected to, hundreds of distribution centers connected to suppliers all over the world, it's, the vaccine distribution's a chip shop, right? So that's my point, is it's just the detailed plan of what you're going to do, and then just the data and analytics behind it as conditions change to make changes on the fly. We would be in a better spot than we're at today.
So given what you just mentioned there, I'm blessing you off as being the vaccine czar for the administration. What would be your top 2 to 3 priorities in a difference in what you've seen from the plan being implemented so far?
Well, I think number one right now, which is going to be fixed very shortly, is production. And, I think the Defense Production Act was put into place, but it was only put into place like a month ago. It could have been put in place sooner. And if you put the Defense Production plan in place for 3 different vaccines in the market, you very quickly get to the point where you reach greater capacity of supply than demand. Like I mentioned, the weak point in the retail, in the distribution system, was at retail, and I think some good things are happening there in regard to relationships with big retailers like the Walgreens and the CVS's. These mass retail facilities, like using big football stadiums to do mass inoculations. So I think those are heading down the right direction. And again, I think it gets into analytics. If you think about supply chain as bigger than physical, how do we use data and analytics to convince 60 to 70% of the population that this is the right thing to do? How do we understand through the data what segments of the population are going to be most concerned about being vaccinated? And then getting into other factors of a post-COVID world from a distribution standpoint is, what does everything look like, right? How does everything change? How does supply chains change? How does what we did, how do we learn from what's happening here? And then, again, how do we look at this challenge bigger than just the United States? And how do we, once we get 60, 70% of our country vaccinated, how do we focus on other parts of the world? This is something that's going to keep us busy for the next 5 years, at least, So people in supply chain are going to be involved when it comes to what does retail look like? What does manufacturing look like? What does distribution look like? What does public policy health look like? What do hospitals look like? All these big challenges, there will be a supply chain person involved in each of them, which is exciting for our field, I think.
Yeah. And with the given situation, how do you feel that like business markets of government institutions, like in the commercial sense, can be more unison in the future to not have such a lag that we've had here recently with this particular issue, but have more of a focus and, like, in a sense, an on order mission to have the infrastructure set up in place, so we're not trying to, reinvent the wheel the next time goes around for something like this?
Yeah. I'll try not to be too political on this one. Is at we have to have an approach to let's look at it this way. Countries that have been effective in managing business as well as managing public health have a really strong public-private partnership arrangement. And when I mention this, it does raise the hair at the end of people's arms. Some people, they'll look at what's happening in, China and the surveillance state, where you have, cameras everywhere, tracking its citizens in just Orwellian ways, right? And they'll focus on that, but they won't focus on what's happening in more liberal democracies like South Korea and Taiwan, and even some progressive places in Europe. And this whole model is just kind of broken in the United States. And it kind of gets into what I was mentioning earlier of, we need to look at business as, we need to separate, big companies and big supply chains from public-private partnerships of, what's best for this country. Because if you look at what's happened, we didn't yet talk about the medical supply chain that is broken. You have large numbers of pharmaceuticals made in other countries, electronic components for medical devices, respirators, active pharmaceutical ingredients, large percentage of PPE being made in other countries. And the question is that the model that supports the best public policy? And, our lack of government strategy has led to one where it hasn't been addressed, and everything's fine under normal circumstances because we have this lean supply chain. But when things break, then all of a sudden we have a crisis on our hands. And I think it's handled better in other countries. And I think this needs to be a pause of reflection of, how do we look at the public and private interests more optimally than, what's best for the stock market?
Yeah, it's sometimes it's just unfortunate. I have empathy for companies that have structured their product line obviously to manage cost overseas, but then let's say like M3 with the mask situation with the N95s, and we just do not have the ability, even with the supply chain being managed effectively, to get things, from point A to point B. Obviously we can do air, we can do freight, we can do a lot of things, but the capacity to do that and stopping everything else to get that, obviously something's got to give, right? And so with that, having dealt with that a little bit on my own, dealing with China and trying to get things out, I definitely have empathy for those people that are managing those products. Do you feel that some of these companies that are producing PPE and things of that nature for national crisis, should they have on hand like 30% of their inventory in country, no matter what, for the event that we have something like this again, and we can manage our own supplies within our own country that much better because we have the supply here? Do you feel like there's something from a national legislative perspective that needs to be introduced to help that?
Yeah, so there's every company and every supply chain of this magnitude does network optimization to figure out the balance between production and inventory, and where do you produce and where do you carry inventory and how much inventory do you carry. And there's been a bastardized term called lean supply chains. And it's another way of saying keep your inventory as low as possible in order to keep your costs down. Mm-hmm. And, when it comes to certain things, it's no harm, no foul. If you run out of basketballs or you run out of, something, sweaters or whatever, it's like, okay, fine. But when it comes to essential materials that are important for the public health, I think that's a different topic. And what's happening today is that everybody's carrying this large amount of inventory, which is making prices go up. And then, it's going to ultimately happen. It's going to, then it's going to get back into a question of, lowering prices in order to increase market share. There will be technologies that will lead to more nearshoring. Reshoring is the wrong term. When it gets into newer technologies, which are more of on-demand, automated production, digital production, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, is going to move more stuff locally. I think the one that I really think is most important is pharmaceuticals. And for a couple of reasons. One is because pharmaceuticals are largely powders. It could be something very simple to create through 3D printing. And given the pricing of pharmaceuticals, it kind of makes a lot of sense, right? So I think that could be a really interesting model of how do you balance out this production inventory in order to keep drug prices down at the same time, make those enough supply.
Yeah. And then with that, do you feel that robotics and AI and supply chain management here in the near future, are you optimistic about it, or do you have reservations with the merging of not only the robotics and AI portion of it, but also the digital aspect of supply chain management, all kind of fusing together in unison?
Yeah. So if I start with, like this whole concept of big data, everybody with their smartphones, all kinds of data flying around, analytics, that's just table stakes for where companies need to go when it comes to supply chain. Artificial intelligence is really coming into play when it comes to predictive analytics, and especially given what happened right now, as our predictive models are woefully short. No one could have predicted, well, actually, I wouldn't say no one. I think some people really thought that something like this was possible. But our predictive tools in supply chain are really weak. We have these 6-week forecasts that are pretty primitive in comparison to how dynamic and fluid and volatile today's supply chains are. So predictive analytics, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, tools like that, I think are critical, and you're going to see a really big focus on it. When it comes to robotics and automation, I think the challenge we face there is what we talked about earlier, and that is, what do you do when you eliminate 6 million people who work in the trucking industry? Where do people work? What do you do when the entire retail industry is automated? These are questions that are bigger than consumer markets, and they can be solved for, but not how we're thinking of it today. And how we're thinking of it today is very limited. And you see the last 20 years of what's happening here, and that is, again, you're getting this bifurcation of people who are involved in high tech and the digital economy, and the people who are being left behind. And we can't talk about supply chains without talking about this, because the supply chains are driving it. And eventually it's going to reach a breaking point. And I think there's signals that it's happening today where there's a lot of frustration of people being left behind. So, we have to figure that one out.
Yeah. And with that, pre-COVID, let's talk a little bit about sustainability, waste management, reuse, recycle, and like designs for recycling. Did you feel that companies were starting to grapple with that within their design process and their manufacturing to kind of understand that the footprint that they're leaving is affecting the globe in a sense? Or do you think that it's more under the, it's just kind of a nice whitewashing of saying, yeah, we're trying to do this, but, the execution of that idea is not actually being implemented on the back end?
Yeah, I think in developed countries, it was, as you mentioned, it was greenwashing, great marketing concepts, everything like that. Problem doesn't really exist today in the developed world. But I was really excited. I'm involved in a lot of this research. I was really excited by what was ready to take place in the developing world, and was actually going to go to a conference in Vietnam with a few other researchers, and we're going to talk to Southeast Asian governments on how to address this problem from a closed loop, better management of waste standpoint. I was really excited on where that was heading. And, of course, right before we were ready to go there, the world was shut down. And now what we have today is an increase in single-use items, whether it comes to, healthcare supplies or restaurants trying to stay open by using takeout containers. And nobody can say anything against this. It's absolutely, more important short-term immediate than what's happening in the environment. But what's interesting here is it'll come back around again. And the other challenge we face is, of course, the worst condition we can have for the environment is people in extreme poverty. And before COVID, we were on this trajectory within 10, 15 years of almost eliminating extreme poverty. And since COVID, we've pushed 20 million people back into it.
Wow.
And so COVID is going to have a double whammy on the environment by not only more single-use stuff, but also just putting more pressure on the environment through more people in extreme poverty.
And so you feel overall with the process of globalization in the last 30, 40 years that, Steven Pinker has put out a lot of information regarding that our lives are in fact a lot better than it has been in the past, the average person per se. Do you feel that supply chain is a big part of that success?
Yeah, supply chain is a huge part of that success. And I think people who are in the sustainability field, some of them understand this, but unfortunately, a lot of them don't. That the best thing we can do for the environment is to pull people from out of extreme poverty. So by having people as a part of the supply chain process, you're doing less damage to the environment. So what he says is absolutely true.
Yeah. So I got a couple of Q&A questions for you from some people. So I'll read a couple of those for you. So with Tesla and Apple kind of being competitors here in the very near future, given Tim Cook's background in supply chain management, do you feel within the next 5 to 10 years that they actually could catch up to Tesla in their battery technology, along with the implementation of their car in the United States and then eventually around the world?
Yeah, I don't think Apple's in any competition for Tesla when it comes to batteries. There are a lot of companies that are. I think where Apple comes into play is really interesting is how cars move more into sort of an app model, more of a service model versus more of a product model, because Apple's really is a winner in that space. Tesla already has a lot of competition on the other side, and that is going to be exciting to watch. But I don't think Apple will be one of those competitors.
Gotcha. And I think there's a lot of, when you're talking about supply chain, I was watching something on YouTube where somebody was discussing the evolution of the gas station experience because of, let's say with Tesla is a 30-minute charge for a supercharge, a roundabout, and you can get about, I think, almost 600 miles now on their battery for the top line version of that. So you're going to have to change the experience of the quick in and out of the gas stations. And I think there's a lot of disruption available here in the near future for people that are going to be designing and implementing that. Have you heard anything recently from your end, from, companies or from the academia level as far as people trying to get that going?
Yeah, I'm actually working with one of the EV startups, and I will tell you that 90% of, and I think it's even higher than that, 90% of charges are happening at home.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're right about this gas station experience, and the question is it even a gas station, or is it, the spots in front of the Whole Foods?
Mm-hmm.
given the fact that most of charging is, people are, if you drive around Metro Denver or wherever you live, you're probably not needing a charge, but a lot of the charging stations are going to be for long-term trips. But yeah, I think it will lead to a disruption in two ways. One of them is, for consumer products companies that, like beer companies I work for, we sell a lot of beer at convenience stores, right? I think the biggest challenge it's going to face is the power grid, the home utility being able to enable people's cars to charge at night, especially in like the California public utility grid can't handle what's going on right now. How is it going to be able to handle it when everybody has an electric car? Mm-hmm. The best power grid in the country is not going to be able to handle this. How's Phoenix, Arizona's power grid going to handle it when people's air conditioners are running 24 hours a day, right? I think these are the bigger challenges of, how is the grid going to support the electrification of our cars?
Got it. And lastly, from a small business perspective, obviously people, processes, and product, right? So where would you recommend startups, small businesses to get more information on how to implement supply chain management that much better in their processes, and what advice would you give them overall, like as far as learning DMAIC, it's an acronym that they used as far as supply chain management?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time. I think what you're finding is you have these two big dinosaurs, Amazon and Walmart. And I don't mean dinosaurs by antiquated, but like just these powerful forces on the planet, right? Just tearing each other apart. And, what I think you're going to find is you're going to find kind of like what happened, when the asteroid hit the Earth and all the dinosaurs died. There was these little mammals that were living in the cracks that all of a sudden became us, right? And I think the startups will kind of follow the same model. And I'm really excited. Like if I was going to tell a small startup, one thing that they should really understand is blockchain, because I think the potential for blockchain to democratize supply chains, where today, Amazon, Walmart, these big companies, they have these massively integrated systems, where they're able, Walmart will work very fluidly with the Procter & Gamble, whereas if you wanted to make toothpaste, you may make a better toothpaste than Procter & Gamble, but you don't have the integration that they have, right? Whereas I think blockchain could liberate some of that and enable companies to fluidly connect within supply chains that are constantly changing. And it will even the odds a little bit. So I would recommend that startups understand that. And I would also have them to be leery of these marketplaces, these Amazon marketplaces that seem so easy for them to set up, but just basically don't enable them to differentiate themselves. I think there's a much better way for them to make their way on the supply chain, but they have to be able to design what that looks like. And I think a lot of startups, and here I'm going to advocate for my field, they need to hire a supply chain professional to be a part of the team to help them with this, right? And a lot of times, they're focusing on marketing and they're focusing on finance versus having somebody who's going to have them, be able to get to market in a much more effective manner, which is how people win in markets.
Right. You brought up an interesting point there. So do you feel that supply chain is a public good and should be regulated as such, like a utility? Like, for example, Amazon just, they use the United States Postal Service to no end to ship their products per se. Should there be some kind of tax included that Amazon should have to front to help assist in the, repairs of that supply chain that we're utilizing and we're overburdening in that aspect, because of it never was intended to be like the public utility was never intended to be a commercial avenue to bring products at this capacity. Do you think something like that will come down the pipe?
Yeah, I think it's instead of suggesting any sort of regulation, I would, and I hate using this term reimagine, but I guess I'll have to use it. Is, reimagine how public entities are utilized by private companies. It's this public-private partnership. So it's not Amazon's fault that the United States Postal Service has a broken model.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, you could go down the same path when you talk about like Medicare. I mean, you could just go down the list of, 21st century economy, and, public utilities, public services have to respond accordingly. And I think some reform is needed there to make it more effective and efficient and efficacious and all that stuff.
Yeah. And lastly, looking forward here in the next couple years, what are the trends that you're seeing already that are kind of being implemented and that we as consumers are going to be seeing here in the near future?
I think this absolute unbelievable use of big data. I tell my students all the time is that, you make life easy for marketers, because you're constantly sending out signals of who you are and what you are. And marketing is becoming very individual. It's becoming very customized. It's becoming very predictive. So the markets are, I would say, beyond efficient. And so I think that's good in some ways. But I think there needs to be a balance in them, right? And you talk about public good. How do we have supply chains become a part of the public good? How do we have supply chains improve how our healthcare system works? How do we have supply chains improve the environment? How do we use supply chains to improve, the plight of inner cities, a big cause of mine, the plight of rural communities, that are being on the left on the outside. So I think it's how do we use markets to solve bigger problems than getting your Halloween costume to you in a day, So I think supply chains have a great future ahead of us if we focus less on the trivial and more on the needed.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I think the sky's the limit with this field. And just out of curiosity, out of your students, what companies are they targeting if they're coming to you and saying, I want to join the supply chain movement? Where do I go? Who do I work for, et cetera? What's the number one, company?
Yeah, so there's two primary paths that are really hot right now. One of them is, of course, logistics field. Companies like FedEx, companies like Amazon. I would even classify Walmart. Big companies that need to continue to change how they go to market, execute, make things happen, right? The big trucking companies, ocean ports, blah, 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 right? And then the second category gets into analytics. And that gets into using big data, using tools for big data, predictive analytics, diagnostic analytics, understanding planning systems, better integration. And that's pretty much every company, Coke, Pepsi, Miller Coors, you name it. All these companies are looking for, analytics, solving things through data, understanding how big data turns into decisions through making, analytics and rationalization.
And when you were in that particular position, what kind of candidate were you looking for when you were hiring those kind of people?
Yeah, I love this question. There's two things I'm looking for. One is somebody who understands how to do things the right way, and that's using structured problem solving. Our field's not big on ideation. We don't need somebody coming out of undergrad or grad school saying, hey, I have an idea, because they don't have the experience. We need them to understand how to use data and analysis to make good decisions. So understanding good structured processes of understanding how to define a problem, gathering data, analyzing it, and coming up with a recommendation. That's one. The other one is people who now know how to get things done through other people. Networking, being able to solve problems through other people, maybe that have different points of view of yours, facilitation skills, good people skills, I would say, is really, really critical. So those are the two that I'd say, understanding some analytics. If you have those skills, you can always get a job in this field.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, this is, I have to, I mean, I'm not blowing smoke or anything. I thought your class is probably one of the most interesting classes we had in the school. Yeah. And just in a sense of, I think that the DU master's program, the MBA program, really, really got top-notch experts in their field to come, once we got past the basics, to really dive into the stuff that I think matters. And I think from what I've seen anyway on LinkedIn and other things, that people have changed their careers because of people like you kind of inspiring them to give it a go. And I think people are already doing really well in those fields. So kudos to DU and the people that they're bringing in to facilitate that change in those industries that people actually have a deep affinity for.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for your time. I think it was very informational for not only myself, but hopefully for others as well. And looking at, in the future, just seeing what DU is going to produce as far as, the overall, program and how that's going to affect change. I'm sure there'll be seminars and conferences and things like that, if you're alumni, you'll be able to go to and see some of the latest developments in this particular field. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again, and look forward to catching up some other time, seeing how when the world's back to normal, so to speak. And,
yeah, let's definitely do that. Let's grab a beer.
Awesome. I know you know where to go.
I do.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. The show is produced and engineered by myself, Ben, out of Denver, Colorado. Be sure to subscribe to our social media or wherever you consume content, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Big shout out to Mike Xavier. Thank you so much for letting us use your music as part of our show. Be sure to check him out as well on social media. And stay tuned for the next show.